For what it's worth, I've gone on for years about the importance of thinking about the long term in relation to the environmental damage, the climate change, everything else.
Behind palace walls, a quiet storm was brewing. King Charles made a wish that would unravel everything. For most of his life, Charles had waited in the shadows. The son of a queen whose reign spanned generations, he was the heir who never ascended, until time finally demanded it. But just as he took the throne he'd been groomed for since birth, fate pulled the rug from beneath him. In early 2024, after a seemingly routine health check for an enlarged prostate, doctors found something else, something far more serious. The word cancer echoed through Buckingham Palace like a silent thunderclap, and with it came a cruel irony. After waiting more than 70 years for the crown, King Charles might not have the time to wear it. In public, the palace released statements that carefully balanced truth with calm reassurance. The king would continue light duties, they said. His treatments were progressing. He remained in good spirits. But behind the finely written updates was a very different story. Week after week, Charles was quietly driven to hospital appointments, slipping in through staff entrances to avoid the press. His days were now measured by medication schedules and private conversations with oncologists. Those close to him began to notice the shift, an uncharacteristic weariness in his tone, heaviness in his gait. He wasn't just facing an illness, he was confronting mortality. And with that came a terrifying thought. What would happen to the monarchy if he could no longer lead it? In these moments of vulnerability, Queen Camilla stepped into a role few had seen coming. Once criticized by the public, she became Charles's anchor, managing royal engagements, shielding him from unnecessary stress, and staying by his side during long hours of treatment. Her transformation wasn't just external. Inside the palace, staff began referring to her as the engine behind Charles's resolve. She adjusted her calendar, attended extra briefings, and even handled foreign dignitaries solo when her husband was too weak to appear. The queen, once branded an outsider, had become indispensable. But as Camilla's influence grew, so too did the unspoken tension that haunted every corridor of the palace. Succession, with Catherine also battling cancer and stepping back from public life, and Prince Harry estranged from the core of the institution, the burden fell squarely on Prince William. Whispers turned to murmurs in closed-door meetings. What if Charles's health declined further? What if the crown needed a steady hand sooner than expected? And yet, in the quietest hours, when the ceremonial titles and public faces fell away, Charles grappled with a question only he could answer. How much longer would he hold on? And who could truly carry what came next? But when Charles reached for comfort, it wasn't Camilla he turned to, it was someone else. She doesn't seek power, she carries it. For as long as the world has watched the royal family, Princess Anne has stood at its edge, not in the shadows, but on solid ground. She's never courted headlines, never vied for attention. And yet, within the castle walls, her presence is commanding, her judgment sought, and her loyalty never in question. In moments when others faltered, Anne stood firm. And now, as the monarchy faced one of its darkest reckonings, it wasn't Queen Camilla or Prince Harry who Charles turned to. It was Anne, his sister, his shield, his unwavering compass through a storm no crown could weather alone. Their bond began before duty ever had a name. At Balmoral, where tradition clashed with the innocence of childhood, Charles and Anne found something rare in royal bloodlines: honest friendship. They weren't raised with soft affection. Queen Elizabeth ruled with stoic grace, and their father, Prince Philip, believed in discipline above emotion. But while others buckled under that weight, Anne didn't just endure it, she embraced it. In the cold Scottish air, the two siblings carved out their own understanding of loyalty. Not the kind scripted for cameras, but the kind forged in silence, built on glances that meant more than words. It was this quiet strength that would set Anne apart in adulthood. While younger royals shied from their duties or grew restless in their roles, Anne never once hesitated. She became the most industrious member of the royal family, attending more engagements than anyone, year after year, without fanfare, and Charles watched. He saw in her a reflection of what the monarchy could still be: duty, honor, and resilience without spectacle. Even as his own family fractured with Meghan and Harry stepping away, and William burdened by rising expectations, Anne remained the constant, always present, always prepared, never pleading for recognition. When tensions deepened between Charles and his sons, especially after the explosive fallout from Harry's departure, it was Anne who stepped in. Not with diplomacy, but with candor. She didn't sugarcoat the truth, and that was why Charles listened. She spoke plainly, daring to challenge the king when others wouldn't. She acted as the bridge between father and sons, between tradition and necessity. And in private, Charles leaned on her more than anyone. While the world assumed Camilla was his pillar, insiders knew better. Anne was the one who knew every fault line in his heart, every shadow in his mind. It wasn't love or romance that defined their connection. It was survival. Through scandals, losses, and now illness, Anne remained his mirror and his conscience. So when the time came to share a truth that could shatter Camilla and reshape the monarchy forever, Charles didn't hesitate. And so, when Charles whispered his final wish, it was Anne, not Camilla, who would carry it forward. It was raining. Anne didn't knock, and the Queen cried. The corridors of Windsor had known centuries of storms, both the kind that howled through the turrets and the ones that whispered behind tightly closed doors. But that day, the rain outside only mirrored the emotional storm gathering within. The castle, draped in its usual grandeur, felt unusually still. No footsteps echoed, no aides bustled with ceremonial urgency. The only sound was the soft patter of rain on leaded glass and the faint rustling of old paper as Queen Camilla sat quietly in a drawing room, thumbing through private letters not meant for public eyes. Letters filled with Charles's musings, regrets, and half-spoken fears. They were her anchor until the door opened without a sound and Anne stepped through. No announcement, no warning, just presence. Anne's arrival alone was enough to silence the staff. She wasn't a woman to visit uninvited unless something monumental was about to be said. Camilla looked up, startled not by fear, but by recognition. Anne wasn't just Charles's sister. She was the bearer of his deepest truths, the courier of messages too fragile to be put in ink. And this message, Camilla could tell, would change everything. The room seemed to draw in a breath it never released. Anne's face, normally unshaken, carried a trace of something colder than sorrow. Resignation. Anne didn't sit. She didn't smile. She simply delivered her brother's wish like a solemn decree. Charles, in a decision made from clarity, not confusion, had chosen to place Prince William at the helm. A regency, not a full abdication, but a handover of power in everything but name. William would lead the monarchy in practice, while Charles remained king in title alone. There would be no televised address, no elaborate crown-passing ceremony, just a quiet reshaping of power, born not of ambition, but necessity. And Camilla, who had stood beside Charles through humiliation, illness, and decades of exile from public grace, was told gently but unflinchingly that her time beside the throne was drawing to a premature close. Camilla didn't interrupt. She didn't object, but her silence was thunderous. As Anne stepped back toward the doorway, a lady-in-waiting entered with tea, only to pause at the threshold. Camilla sat frozen, her hand pressed against her mouth, eyes welling, tears falling in a slow, dignified betrayal of all she had tried to suppress. Her whisper was barely audible but carved into the air, like a wound. After everything, she wasn't mourning the power. She was mourning the story that would now go unfinished, the reign they had waited their whole lives to begin, now slipping away without applause or ending. Camilla had not just lost position. She had lost the very purpose she had built herself around. But what exactly had Charles decided, and why now? Charles waited a lifetime for the throne, and yet he chose to pass it on. It was the most unexpected twist in the story of a man who had spent 7 decades waiting. No monarch in waiting had endured such a long and winding road to the crown. Through scandal, exile, divorce, and national heartbreak, Charles had stood on the fringes of power, patient, prepared, poised. And finally, after Queen Elizabeth's passing, he stepped into the light as king. But almost as soon as the crown touched his head, he was hit with another reality, one no title could shield him from: cancer. And with it came something far more consuming than pain: clarity. Inside the walls of Highgrove, in rooms lined with family portraits and landscapes he once painted to escape duty, Charles began questioning everything. What does a monarch owe his country when his body is failing? What happens when the title he's held in waiting no longer serves the people who need leadership now? It wasn't a breakdown, it was a reckoning. And slowly, he arrived at the unthinkable. He wouldn't step down, but he would step aside. Not with ceremony, but with strategy. This wouldn't be a surrender. It would be a transfer of function, not form. A regency in silence. History had known regencies before, but none quite like this. When King George III slipped into mental instability, his son took the reins out of necessity. That regency was chaotic, riddled with gossip and suspicion, driven by a monarch who could no longer distinguish delusion from reality. But Charles's mind was clear. His intention was measured. He was not spiraling into incapacity. He was rising into responsibility. He knew that in an age of rapid change, the monarchy could no longer be reactive. It needed to be reborn in real time, and only one man could do that: his son. William represented not just youth, but evolution, a bridge between tradition and relevance. Charles didn't resent that truth. He embraced it. He had seen how the world responded to William's empathy, Catherine's grace, their shared image of a modern royal family. He recognized that the public didn't just need a symbol anymore, they needed a voice, a steady presence. And though Charles's hands still signed state papers and met with prime ministers, his heart knew the true power was already shifting. Quietly, deliberately, without headlines. The decision remained a guarded secret. Anne knew. A handful of aides knew. But there was no public decree, no formal declaration of regency. Charles wasn't handing over the throne, he was investing in the future. It was an act of humility few leaders make, and it may become one of the most defining moves in modern royal history. And while the world saw King Charles in power, behind closed doors, Prince William was already stepping into the crown. He didn't seize power. He earned it. There was no formal handover, no trumpets, no proclamation. But those who had long watched the inner workings of the royal household understood what was happening. Prince William wasn't waiting for the crown he was already wearing, in everything but name. The shift was subtle at first, an increased presence at diplomatic receptions, private briefings with ministers that once reported solely to the king, invitations redirected, letters signed. He began chairing sensitive internal meetings, coordinating with Commonwealth representatives, overseeing engagements that, just months earlier, would have passed through Charles. But no one questioned it, because when William walked into a room, he brought with him not just his lineage, but a calm, commanding sense of leadership the country hadn't seen in decades. The public noticed it too. While the monarchy faced one of its most fragile transitions, in modern history with Charles battling cancer and Catherine recovering from her own diagnosis, William stood tall, not with bravado, but with unwavering composure. He visited hospitals without cameras, attended charity events with sincerity, and gave short, measured statements that resonated with a grieving, anxious public. He embodied something the institution had nearly lost: trust. The British people, once skeptical of the crown's relevance, began to look at William differently, not as a figurehead in waiting, but as the monarch they already believed in. And, yet, the weight he carried behind palace gates was far heavier than it seemed. His father was growing weaker by the week. His wife, the cornerstone of his public image and personal life, was fighting a private battle that consumed their home in quiet dread. Their 3 young children were too young to understand the headlines, but not too young to feel the tension. Every decision he made had to balance duty and compassion, tradition and innovation, public service and personal sacrifice. William was no longer just a prince. He had become the bridge between the past and the future. And the path he was walking? It wasn't paved. He was carving it out in real time, but perhaps the most profound change wasn't seen by the public at all. It was whispered in palace halls and mirrored in the behavior of staff who now deferred to him the way they once had to Charles. Advisors began consulting William first. Policies were drafted with his input. Even the Queen's personal aides began noticing that Camilla's calendar was thinning, while William's was multiplying. The monarchy was evolving, and William wasn't just adapting to that shift. He was guiding it, slowly, carefully, without fanfare. He wasn't wearing a crown. Not yet. But in the eyes of the institution, and increasingly, the world he already ruled with the quiet strength of a king. And while William rose with grace, Camilla felt herself slowly vanishing. She stood beside the king. Now, she watches from the heir sidelines. For decades, Camilla had fought tooth and nail to earn her place not just in Charles's heart, but beside his throne. She had endured whispers, headlines, and the unbearable weight of public disdain. And when the day finally came, when she walked behind the crown and was named Queen Consort, it wasn't just a title. It was the culmination of a long, bitter battle for legitimacy. Every smile, every handshake, every carefully worded statement had been a brick in the empire she built not for power, but for permanence. And yet, just as that permanence began to take root, it began to vanish. It started slowly. Her name was left off briefings she once led. Her calendar, once packed with engagements, began thinning without explanation. Doors she once entered without hesitation were now closed, or worse, redirected. And in private, the silence was louder than anything she'd ever known. Charles, once fiercely reliant on her counsel, now deferred to William. The unspoken shift wasn't cruel. It was calculated, a realignment designed for a monarchy in motion, one that no longer had a place for a queen without a throne. Behind the closed doors of Windsor and Highgrove, Camilla's world grew smaller. She continued to perform her duties with grace, smiling at cameras, attending events, projecting the image of a woman still at the heart of royal life. But in her private moments, the strain tore through her. Palace aides noticed her growing distance, the long pauses during meetings, the sudden tears that followed phone calls no one else heard. Those closest to her admitted she cried in rooms where she once made decisions, and not out of vanity but loss, the loss of a role she had sacrificed everything to fulfill. What made it harder was that the transition was not formalized. There was no edict removing her from power. There was no dramatic fall from grace. It was the slow erosion of relevance, a daily fading into the background as William's star rose and Charles quietly receded into the shadows of his own legacy. Camilla wasn't thrown out. She was absorbed into silence. Desperate for clarity, she turned to constitutional experts. She needed to know what happens when a queen consort becomes a ghost in her own palace. Was there precedent for her diminished presence? Could she still wield influence? Or was her fate sealed by a decision that had never even been spoken to, her aloud? The answers she received were vague, diplomatic. Her role existed in name. But names, she realized, didn't command rooms. Power did. And hers had slipped through her fingers like water she could no longer hold. But even in heartbreak, Camilla chose not bitterness but duty. Before stepping back, she laid the path forward. Camilla may have watched her role diminish, but she refused to let her presence fade into irrelevance. In the twilight of her influence, she found purpose not in holding on, but in letting go with intention. The pain of losing her place beside the king was sharp, but it did not crush her. Instead, it redirected her. She knew the future of the monarchy wouldn't rest on her shoulders. It would rest on Catherine's. And Camilla, with all her experience, her scars, and her understanding of public resistance, began preparing the woman who would one day take her place not by decree, but by quiet design. Behind the scenes, Camilla started offering guidance to the Princess of Wales not through ceremony or instruction, but through subtle gestures, private conversations, and shared confidences. She knew what it meant to be vilified, to be misunderstood, to carry the weight of expectations that could never fully be met. And she saw in Catherine someone who, despite her grace and popularity, was now being pulled deeper into the same unforgiving machinery. Camilla didn't lecture. She listened. She offered what only experience could provide, the knowledge of how to survive the role, not just perform it. Even as her world contracted, Camilla remained fiercely loyal to Charles. She stood beside him during treatments, managed his appearances with care, and continued to show unwavering support in public. Every moment of grief she carried privately was countered by a moment of grace she displayed publicly. She would not allow her sorrow to eclipse his legacy. This was a man who had waited a lifetime to lead, only to be asked by fate to step aside. Camilla understood the magnitude of that sacrifice, and she made it her mission to ensure his name remained untarnished. In her remaining appearances, Camilla never faltered. There were no cracks in her smile, no slips in her composure. The woman who once wept behind palace doors now stood before cameras with poise. She was no longer fighting for herself. She was protecting the bridge between generations. Her efforts weren't about reclaiming status. They were about stability, about safeguarding a monarchy that had endured too many fractures to risk another. Most critically, she became the silent thread weaving together 3 royal generations. She spoke privately with William, gave time to Catherine, and even found ways to gently connect with young George, planting the seeds of a legacy that could one day flourish far beyond her name. Camilla knew she would not be the face of the future, but she could ensure the future was ready to shine. As one queen faded, another quietly prepared to rise. While one crown paused, another glimmered quietly in the background. As Queen Camilla stepped back from the spotlight with a heavy but purposeful heart, another figure, quiet, dignified, and immensely admired, began to step forward. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was in no condition to make grand returns. Still recovering from her own health battle, she remained mostly out of sight. But in that absence, something profound occurred. Admiration for her didn't fade. Gratitude multiplied. The world wasn't asking where she was. They were standing by, waiting for her to return. And that rare kind of loyalty, the kind that doesn't require constant presence, spoke louder than any speech or royal decree. Behind the palace walls, Camilla's mentorship had taken root. The once complicated relationship between the 2 women had evolved. What began as a careful coexistence had transformed into a quiet alliance. Camilla, now aware of her fading influence, found solace in guiding the woman who would soon be wearing the weight of the monarchy. And Catherine, in turn, listened not out of obligation, but out of respect. She knew Camilla's journey had been forged through fire. There was wisdom in her survival, and Catherine absorbed every word, every warning, and every whisper of advice like it was scripture. Meanwhile, William had already become the central force of the monarchy. He no longer needed formal confirmation. Inside the palace, staff addressed him with the deference once reserved only for the sovereign. Senior government officials began routing sensitive briefings through his private office. Foreign dignitaries extended invitations bearing his name first. He was leading without coronation, commanding without needing the scepter. And yet, every move he made was carefully measured, not to eclipse his father, but to preserve the crown's integrity during one of its most delicate transitions. Together, William and Catherine represented something the monarchy hadn't felt in decades: unity, poised, respected, sympathetic. They were the embodiment of a modern royal identity anchored in history, yet pointed unmistakably toward the future. The public saw in them the grace of Elizabeth, the moral strength of Diana, and the vision of a new Britain. People no longer speculated about their readiness. They quietly began to refer to them as the monarchy's true center. But the change wasn't just in perception, it was becoming institutional. Meetings once chaired by King Charles were now being finalized by William. Charitable engagements previously coordinated by Camilla were passed down to Catherine, even in her recovery. And while Catherine wasn't physically present, her influence, through speeches she had written, causes she had launched, and lives she had touched, never faded. In hushed tones, palace aides whispered of inevitability, that the future wasn't just approaching, it had already arrived, clothed in quiet confidence and compassionate leadership. But it was the moment Charles's signature appeared beneath one document that changed it all. It wasn't a coronation, but it was the beginning of a new reign. No fanfare, no golden scepter lifted into the air, no anthem echoing through Westminster. And yet, with one stroke of a pen beneath an official document, everything changed. King Charles, in quiet dignity, signed a royal consent that transferred day-to-day powers of the crown not ceremonially, but constitutionally to his son. The world didn't see it. There was no breaking news. But inside the palace, where legacy and duty pass from one heartbeat to the next, the weight of the moment was undeniable. The regency had begun. From that day forward, William carried the crown not on his head, but in his every move. Every red box of government briefings was addressed to him. Every weekly meeting with ministers, foreign envoys, and national leaders was held in his private office. He chaired Privy Council sessions. He reviewed national budgets. He signed decrees. In every meaningful way, he had become the king in action. Yet, officially, the crown still belonged to Charles, a man who now watched from the edge of history, not in bitterness, but in love. His legacy lived on through his son, and he embraced that quiet truth with grace. Charles no longer led. He guided me. He became a symbol respected, preserved, and protected. His health kept him from standing where he once did, but his pride in William never faltered. And for Camilla, her place too had transformed. No longer beside the throne, she moved gently into the role of elder stateswoman. While no longer the public face of the monarchy, she remained a revered figure within its walls. Her poise, her sacrifices, and her silent devotion did not go unnoticed. And while she no longer shaped the future, she had ensured it had a steady foundation. One meeting marked it all. Quiet, private, just father and son, seated across from each other with no titles, no staff, no audience. Charles, aged by illness but sharpened by clarity, reached across the table as William stood to leave. A pause. A hand placed gently on William's shoulder. No words needed. It was a gesture that said everything. A king acknowledging another, not through ceremony, but through blood, love, and understanding. And while the world waits for the next crown, the true question remains, is Britain ready for a king who never asked for the throne, but quietly claimed it anyway? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.